man can lose a barn in one night, the old ranchers used to say, but he learns who his neighbors are when the smoke clears. On the far edge of Red Hollow Valley, where the dry grass stretched for miles and the wind carried the smell of dust and cedar, Elias Carter watched the last beam of his barn collapse into glowing embers. The flames had already died down, leaving only thin trails of smoke curling into the pale desert sky. Around the open yard stood the townsmen of Dry Creek, hats low, boots planted in the dirt, saying little but making sure Elias could feel their presence. Some leaned against fence posts. Some kept their hands tucked into their coats against the cold night air. Not one of them moved to help. Sheriff Wade Collins stood closest to the road, his silver badge catching the faint firelight as he looked over the blackened timbers that had once been Elias Carter's livelihood. A man could measure a rancher's life by what stood in that barn. Saddles worn smooth by years of riding, hay stacked for the winter, tools that had been passed down through more seasons than anyone could remember. Now it was all quiet, the structure reduced to a low skeleton of charred wood and drifting smoke. Collins tipped his hat back slightly and let out a slow breath that fogged in the cold air. "Maybe next time you'll remember whose side you're on," he said calmly. Elias Carter didn't answer. He stood about 20 feet from the ruins, boots planted in the sand, hat shadowing his eyes. He wasn't a large man, and he didn't carry the loud confidence many ranchers did. But he had the steady posture of someone used to long days in the saddle and longer nights watching storms roll across the plains. The wind tugged lightly at his coat as he studied the wreckage that had taken him 10 years to build. The townsmen shifted quietly. One of them cleared his throat. Another glanced down the road toward town as if the business here had already ended. The truth was simple enough. Everyone in Dry Creek knew why the barn had burned. 2 nights earlier, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wind howled across the valley like a train through Canyon Rock, a woman and a young girl had come riding out of the dark. They were Apache. Their horse was exhausted. The girl had been wrapped in a thin blanket, holding tight to her mother's arm. Every house in town had turned them away, except Elias Carter's. He had opened the door, brought them inside, and set coffee on the stove without asking questions. In Red Hollow Valley, that single decision had traveled faster than a prairie fire. Now the results stood before him in quiet black ruins beneath a sky full of cold stars. Sheriff Collins gave the barn one last look, then turned toward the road. The other men followed slowly, boots crunching through the gravel as they drifted away from the yard. No threats, no shouting, just silence. Soon the ranch was empty again, except for the faint glow of cooling ash and the rancher who still stood watching it. Elias Carter remained there long after the last lantern disappeared down the road. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of burned pine across the valley. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called once and then fell quiet. And by the time the first gray light of morning crept over the distant hills, something strange had begun to settle across Red Hollow Valley. A silence deeper than the night before. The sun rose slowly over Red Hollow Valley, but the morning did not sound like any other morning Elias Carter had known. Normally, the first light would bring movement. Cattle shifting in the grass. A distant wagon rolling along the county road. The wind brushing through the cottonwoods near the creek. But this morning felt different. The air carried a stillness that made the open land feel smaller, almost as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Elias stood beside the blackened frame of what had been his barn, his hands resting on the top rail of the fence that had somehow survived the night. The wood beneath his palms felt cold and rough, and when he looked out across the pasture, he saw the same empty stretch of land he had worked for more than a decade. A few scattered boards still smoked behind him, sending thin ribbons into the pale blue sky. The horses he had managed to guide out during the fire stood quietly near the far fence line, their heads low as they searched the ground for the last of the dry winter grass. Nothing moved beyond them, not even the wind. Elias had lived in Red Hollow Valley long enough to understand the rhythm of the place. A man could ride 20 miles in any direction and still see the same wide land rolling under the sky. People noticed things out here. A wagon arriving, a storm building over the ridge, a stranger riding down the trail. The land carried news the way rivers carried water. That was why the silence unsettled him. It had been 2 nights earlier when the knocking came at his door, long after the last light in Dry Creek had faded and the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the water bucket beside the porch. Elias had been sitting near the stove with a cup of coffee when he heard it. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, just careful. He had opened the door to find a woman standing there with the cold wind pressing against her back. Her dark hair had been pulled tight beneath a worn scarf, and beside her stood a little girl who could not have been more than 8 years old, wrapped in a thin blanket that barely reached her boots. Their horse waited a few yards away with its head lowered, breath drifting into the frozen air. The woman had not stepped forward. She had only spoken quietly. She said that they had come through Dry Creek and that every door had been closed to them. She said they only needed a place to rest until morning. Elias had looked at the girl first. The child had been tired enough that her eyes struggled to stay open, and the cold had painted her cheeks pale beneath the dust of the trail. That had been enough. Elias Carter had stepped aside and opened the door wider without asking their names or their story. Inside the cabin, the stove had been warm and the coffee still hot. The woman had thanked him with a nod that carried more relief than words ever could. The girl had sat near the stove and slowly unwrapped the blanket while Elias placed bread and a small pot of beans on the table. No one had spoken much that night. The wind had rattled the windows, and the quiet warmth of the room had done the rest. By sunrise the next morning, they had already saddled their horse. The woman had thanked him again before leading the girl out across the pasture road toward the distant hills. Elias had watched them ride away until they disappeared beyond the low ridge east of the valley. He had thought that was the end of it. But in a place like Red Hollow Valley, nothing stayed quiet for long. By mid-morning, the road to Dry Creek had begun to stir again, but the movement carried a different tone than usual. Wagons rolled slower. Riders spoke in lower voices. News had already traveled through the valley the way wind carries dust across open land. Everyone knew what had happened 2 nights earlier, and everyone knew who had opened his door when the rest of the town had turned its back. Elias Carter rode into town just after the sun climbed high enough to warm the wooden storefronts along the main street. His horse moved at an easy pace, hooves tapping softly against the hard-packed dirt road that ran between the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the weathered saloon that sat at the far end of the street like an old guard watching the town. Men standing outside the store paused when they saw him approach. Conversations stopped halfway through sentences. A few hats tipped in quiet greeting, but most faces remained still, their eyes following Elias as he guided his horse toward the hitching rail. He dismounted slowly, tying the reins the same way he had done 100 times before, but the air around him carried a weight that had not been there in the past. Inside the saloon, the morning light spilled through the front windows, catching the dust that drifted through the air like tiny sparks. The room smelled of coffee and old pine boards. A handful of ranchers sat at the tables, their voices low, their eyes lifting the moment Elias stepped through the door. Sheriff Wade Collins leaned against the bar with one elbow resting on the polished wood, turning a small tin cup slowly in his hand, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. The sheriff was a tall man with a steady posture and the quiet confidence that came from wearing a badge in a place where people preferred order over trouble. When Elias walked in, Collins studied him for a long moment before speaking. The room had grown quiet enough that every man inside could hear the scrape of a chair against the floor. Collins finally set the cup down and spoke in a calm voice that carried across the room. He said that Dry Creek had its own way of keeping peace. He said that people in the valley depended on one another, and that trust mattered more than anything else on the frontier. Then he said that opening a door to strangers who rode in from the hills could create problems the town did not need. Elias listened without interrupting. He removed his hat and rested it on the table beside him, his expression steady, the same calm look he carried through long cattle drives and hard winters. One of the ranchers near the window shifted in his seat and muttered that kindness could sometimes look like disloyalty in a place where neighbors depended on each other for safety. Another man nodded slowly, staring into his cup of coffee, as if the answer might be floating somewhere inside it. Sheriff Collins let the silence stretch before speaking again. He said that what happened in Red Hollow Valley did not stay hidden for long. He said the valley remembered who stood with the town and who stood apart from it. The words were not loud, but they carried weight. Elias Carter picked up his hat and placed it back on his head. He finished the cup of coffee in front of him, set the empty tin gently on the table, and stood. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. Instead, he walked toward the door and stepped back into the sunlight where the open valley waited beyond the last row of buildings. Behind him, the saloon remained quiet long after the door closed. And before the sun began to fall that evening, the message from Dry Creek would travel back across the open land toward the ranch at the edge of Red Hollow Valley. The ride back to the ranch took longer than usual that afternoon, though the distance between Dry Creek and Elias Carter's land had not changed in 10 years. The road curved through open prairie where the grass bent low under a steady breeze, and the mountains beyond Red Hollow Valley sat blue and quiet against the horizon. Elias rode slowly, the leather saddle creaking softly with each step of his horse. He did not rush. There was no reason to rush. Out here, time moved the way the land allowed it to move. Still, the conversation from the saloon lingered in the back of his mind like a distant echo. Sheriff Wade Collins had not raised his voice. None of the men had shouted or made threats. But the words had carried something heavier than anger. It was the tone people used when they believed a line had been crossed. By the time Elias reached the low ridge that overlooked his pasture, the sun had already begun its slow fall toward the western hills. Long shadows stretched across the valley floor, painting the land in deep gold and quiet blue. From that ridge a man could see nearly every acre of Red Hollow Valley. The creek winding through the cottonwoods. The distant cattle trails etched into the dust. The small cluster of buildings that made up Dry Creek sitting miles away like a handful of wooden boxes against the plain. And there, near the edge of the valley, stood Elias Carter's ranch. At least what remained of it. The smoke had faded by the time he arrived, but the smell of burned wood still hung in the air like a memory that refused to leave. The barn that had once stood tall beside the corral now existed only as a dark outline against the ground. Charred beams leaned inward like tired bones. The wide doors that once opened to the morning sun were gone, replaced by a scattered ring of blackened boards resting in the dirt. Elias guided his horse through the gate and dismounted beside the fence. The animals he had managed to move away during the night stood quietly along the far pasture, their ears flicking toward him as he walked past. They seemed calm now, though the scent of smoke still drifted faintly across the yard. Elias paused beside the ruins and rested his hand against one of the surviving fence posts. The wood felt rough and dry under his palm. 10 years of work had gone into building that barn. Long days cutting timber from the hills. Long nights hammering beams into place under lantern light while the wind swept across the valley floor. It had never been the biggest barn in Red Hollow Valley, but it had been enough. Enough for horses. Enough for hay. Enough for a rancher who preferred quiet work over loud company. The sky above the valley slowly shifted from gold to deep orange as the sun dropped lower. Somewhere near the creek, a hawk circled high in the fading light. The land seemed peaceful again, almost as if the events of the previous night had already begun to drift away like smoke in the wind. But Elias Carter had lived long enough on the frontier to understand something most men learn too late. Trouble on the plains rarely arrived with shouting. It arrived quietly, often in the form of silence. As the last light of day slipped behind the distant hills, Elias stepped away from the ruins and looked across the wide stretch of Red Hollow Valley. The wind had faded again. The cattle stood still. Even the trees near the creek barely moved. And somewhere beyond the far ridge, miles away where the desert road disappeared into the mountains, a thin line of dust had begun to rise into the evening sky. Morning arrived slowly over Red Hollow Valley, but the silence that had begun the night before had not lifted. Elias Carter noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the porch with his tin cup of coffee. Usually by sunrise the valley had a sound to it. The soft rustle of wind moving through the tall grass. The distant shuffle of cattle drifting toward water. Sometimes the faint rumble of a wagon miles away along the county road. But that morning the land felt strangely still, as if the valley itself were waiting. Elias leaned one shoulder against the porch post and looked out across the pasture. The light of early morning stretched long shadows over the ground, turning the dust pale gold. His horses stood near the far fence line, quiet and alert, their ears pointed toward the distant hills. Even they seemed to sense that something had shifted in the air. Elias followed their gaze toward the ridge that marked the eastern edge of Red Hollow Valley. At first he saw nothing unusual. The hills sat calm beneath the wide sky, their rocky slopes painted with the soft colors of dawn. Then, after a long moment, he noticed the faint movement rising above the horizon. It was dust, not the drifting dust that followed a single rider or a passing wagon, but a wide ribbon of pale brown rising slowly into the morning light. Elias set his coffee cup down on the porch railing without looking away. Out here a man learned to read distance the way sailors read the ocean. The dust was far away, at least 2 miles beyond the ridge, but it was moving steadily toward the valley. Whatever caused it was not traveling fast. It moved with a calm, even rhythm. Elias stepped down from the porch and walked across the yard, stopping beside the fence where the burned remains of the barn still rested in quiet black shapes against the ground. The smell of smoke had faded overnight, but the memory of the fire still clung to the air. He rested both hands on the top rail and watched the distant line of dust grow clearer as the sun climbed higher behind him. The valley remained silent. No wagons moved along the road to Dry Creek. No riders appeared on the western trail. Even the birds that normally circled above the cottonwoods near the creek seemed absent from the sky. Only that line of dust continued forward, slowly crossing the ridge like a distant storm rolling across the plains. As the minutes passed, shapes began to form beneath the rising cloud. At first they looked like dark specks against the pale ground. Then the specks stretched into lines. Elias narrowed his eyes, the way a man does when he tries to see through heat and distance. Riders. Not one. Not 5. Dozens. The formation moved together with steady purpose, spreading across the ridge in a wide arc that followed the shape of the hills. The sunlight caught small flashes of movement among them, glints of metal and leather reflecting the morning sky. Elias Carter did not move. He had lived long enough on the frontier to recognize the difference between travelers and something else entirely. Travelers rode loosely. Their paths drifted and changed with the land. These riders moved like a single thought carried across the hills. The dust rose higher as they reached the crest of the ridge, and for the first time the full line of them appeared against the open sky of Red Hollow Valley. There were far more riders than Elias had first imagined, enough to stretch across the entire slope of the ridge nearly a mile wide. They did not shout. They did not wave or signal. They simply rode forward until their horses reached the edge of the valley, and then, one by one, the line slowed. Within moments, the entire ridge stood filled with silent figures watching the ranch below. And for the first time that morning, Elias Carter understood why Red Hollow Valley had fallen so quiet. The riders did not move for a long time. They stood along the ridge like shadows carved into the morning sky, their horses quiet beneath them, the dust slowly settling around their silhouettes. Elias Carter remained beside the broken fence rail, watching the line stretch across the hills nearly a mile wide. The distance between them and the ranch was close to 1.5 miles, but even from that far away, he could see the steady posture of the riders. None of them waved. None of them called out. They simply looked down into Red Hollow Valley. The sunlight climbed higher behind Elias, casting a pale glow across the land and revealing more details with every passing minute. Leather saddles, long dark braids, the faint movement of feathers tied near bridles. Elias had seen riders like this before, years ago during cattle drives that carried him near the desert territories farther south. Apache riders did not travel in large groups without reason. They did not appear on ridges just to watch a valley wake up. Something had brought them here. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the dry grass crunching beneath his boots. Behind him the ranch sat quiet. The burned frame of the barn rested low against the ground like the shadow of what it used to be. The horses near the pasture fence lifted their heads again, their ears still pointed toward the ridge. Even the cattle near the creek had stopped moving, forming a loose circle as they stared toward the distant line of riders. Time passed slowly. 5 minutes, maybe 10. The valley remained silent except for the faint creak of leather drifting down from the ridge when a horse shifted its stance. Then something changed. One rider near the center of the formation guided his horse a few steps forward. The movement was small, but in a line that large it was impossible to miss. The rider wore a long dark coat that moved slightly in the morning breeze, and beside him another figure appeared from the line behind. Smaller, lighter. The two horses walked slowly down the slope, leaving the rest of the riders standing in place along the ridge like a silent wall. Elias did not move as the pair descended toward the valley floor. The distance between them closed gradually. First a mile, then half a mile. The sound of their horses finally reached him, soft hooves brushing against dry ground. As they drew closer, the shapes became clear. The first rider was an older man with silver threaded through his hair, his posture straight and calm in the saddle. The second rider rode slightly behind him. A woman. Elias recognized her before the horses had crossed the last stretch of pasture. It was the same woman who had stood on his porch 2 nights earlier with the cold wind behind her. The same woman who had asked only for shelter until morning. Her horse stopped a few steps behind the older rider as they reached the edge of the ranch yard. For a moment, none of them spoke. The valley behind them remained completely still, the long line of riders watching from the ridge without moving. Finally, the older man guided his horse 1 step forward and looked down at the blackened shape of the burned barn before turning his eyes toward Elias Carter. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the quiet yard with calm certainty. He said that the woman Elias had helped was his daughter, and then he said something that made the silence in Red Hollow Valley grow even heavier. He said that kindness had a way of traveling farther than fire. The older man allowed the silence to settle before speaking again, the kind of silence that belonged to wide land and long memory. His horse stood calmly in the yard, its dark mane shifting slightly in the morning breeze. Behind him, the woman Elias had helped 2 nights earlier sat quietly in her saddle, her eyes resting on the burned remains of the barn. The older man finally looked back toward the ridge where the long line of riders still waited without movement. From the valley floor they appeared almost like part of the land itself, stretched across the hills in quiet patience. When he turned back to Elias Carter, his voice carried the steady tone of someone who had spoken to many men across many years. He said that the woman's name was Nara. He said the child who had been wrapped in the blanket that night was his granddaughter. And he said that the riders waiting on the ridge were warriors from several families who had followed them through the hills when word spread that Nara had returned safely from the valley. Elias listened without speaking. The wind brushed softly across the pasture, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant cedar. Nara guided her horse forward a few steps until she sat even with the older rider. The sunlight revealed the tired lines that still lingered around her eyes, but there was also a quiet strength in the way she held the reins. She looked toward the blackened shape of the barn for a moment before turning her attention back to Elias. She said that when she and her daughter rode into Dry Creek that night, they had knocked on 5 doors before reaching the ranch at the edge of the valley. 5 doors had closed. Only one had opened. The older man nodded slowly as she spoke, then rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn. He said that men often believed kindness disappeared like footprints in the sand, but in truth it traveled farther than most people understood. Word of what had happened in the valley had reached their camp before sunrise the day after the fire. Riders had followed the story across the desert trails until they learned exactly where the ranch stood and who had chosen to show mercy when others had refused. The older man then guided his horse slightly to the side so he could see the burned structure more clearly. For a long moment, he studied the broken beams and darkened boards that lay scattered across the yard. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but carried a weight that seemed to reach all the way to the distant ridge. He said that fire had taken the rancher's barn, but it had not taken the truth of what had happened in Red Hollow Valley. He said the riders on the ridge had come because a valley that allowed kindness to burn should also be willing to watch what followed. Elias Carter stood quietly beside the fence, his hat shading his eyes as he looked past them toward the long line of riders spread across the hills. They had not moved once since the 2 riders descended into the valley. They simply waited, their presence stretching across the horizon like a living boundary. The older man then looked back toward Elias and said something that seemed to settle deep into the quiet air of the ranch yard. He said that sometimes the strongest answer a man could give was not anger and not revenge, but the simple act of remembering who had stood alone when the fire was lit. The older man finished speaking and the quiet returned to the ranch yard, stretching across the pasture like a long shadow. Elias Carter stood beside the fence and looked past him toward the ridge where the riders waited. Nearly 200 horses lined the crest of the hill, their shapes dark against the bright morning sky. They had not moved. They had not raised their voices. They had simply watched the valley in silence. For a moment, the only sound was the faint breeze passing through the dry grass. Then the older man lifted one hand slowly and turned in his saddle. The motion was calm and deliberate, but it carried across the distance like a signal understood by everyone who stood on that ridge. Far above them, the long line of riders began to shift. Not in anger, not in haste. Horses stepped forward one by one, descending the slope in quiet order. The movement spread across the ridge like a ripple across water until the entire line began to flow down toward the valley floor. Elias watched them approach, the dust rising again beneath their horses as the riders crossed the open land. The sound of hooves slowly filled the valley, not loud or threatening, just steady and certain. When they reached the ranch yard, they did not form a circle. They did not surround the house. Instead, they guided their horses toward the open ground beside the burned barn. One rider dismounted, then another. Soon dozens of them stood beside their horses looking at the blackened beams scattered across the dirt. Nara stepped down from her saddle and walked a few steps forward until she stood beside the broken structure. She rested her hand lightly against one of the charred boards and then looked back toward her father. The older man nodded once. Without another word, the riders began to move among the remains of the barn. Some lifted fallen beams and carried them aside. Others gathered tools from their saddlebags. One man walked to the edge of the pasture and began cutting straight young trees from a small stand of cottonwood near the creek. The work spread quickly but calmly, like people who had done the same task many times before. Elias remained where he stood, watching the quiet effort unfold in front of him. No one gave loud instructions. No one hurried. Yet within minutes, the burned remains had been cleared into a neat pile beside the corral. Fresh timbers were dragged into place across the open ground where the barn had once stood. The valley that had been silent all morning slowly filled with the sounds of work. Wood being lifted, rope being pulled tight, horses shifting patiently nearby. From the ridge above, the last of the riders descended to join the others until the entire valley floor seemed alive with steady movement. Hours passed beneath the wide western sky. By midday, the first tall beams of the new structure were already standing upright against the bright blue horizon. The frame of a new barn slowly began to rise from the same ground where the fire had taken the old one. Elias Carter finally stepped forward across the yard and stopped beside the older man who had remained mounted near the fence. They both looked at the growing structure for a moment before the man spoke again in the same calm voice. He said that valleys remember what happens inside them, and sometimes the best way to answer a burned kindness is not with anger, but with something stronger than fire. By late afternoon, the shape of the new barn stood tall against the wide sky of Red Hollow Valley. The frame rose strong and straight where the blackened ruins had rested only hours earlier. Fresh cottonwood beams caught the sunlight, their pale wood glowing warm against the blue horizon. The steady rhythm of work had slowly faded as the last ropes were tied and the final boards were lifted into place. One by one, the riders stepped back from the structure they had built together. Horses shifted quietly nearby, their shadows stretching long across the dusty ground. Elias Carter stood a few steps away from the barn and looked up at the new frame that now stood where the old one had burned. It was larger than the first barn he had built years ago. Stronger, too. The beams were thicker and the posts set deeper into the ground, as if the men who raised it had intended it to stand through many winters to come. Nara walked across the yard carrying a small wooden bucket and handed it to one of the riders who had been working near the corral. She paused for a moment beside Elias and followed his gaze toward the barn. Her expression carried the quiet calm of someone who understood the meaning behind what had happened that day. Out on the ridge above the valley, the long line of horses had begun to gather again. Riders mounted slowly, guiding their horses into formation the same way they had appeared that morning. The older man who had spoken earlier turned his horse toward Elias Carter once more. The late afternoon sun rested low behind him, outlining his figure in warm gold light. He looked across the ranch yard and then toward the barn that now stood tall against the valley sky. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same steady calm that had filled the valley since morning. He said that land remembers the choices made upon it. He said that sometimes a single act of kindness can travel farther than a man ever expects, crossing hills and rivers and reaching people he has never met. The riders began to move slowly across the valley floor, their horses stepping quietly along the same trail that had carried them down from the ridge. No one hurried. No one spoke loudly. The long line stretched across the open land as they made their way back toward the distant hills. Nara mounted her horse and paused beside her father for a final moment before turning toward the trail. Elias Carter watched them ride across the valley until the dust of their passing slowly faded into the evening air. Soon the ridge stood empty again, the wide horizon stretching quiet and open beneath the fading sun. The valley returned to the stillness it had known for generations. Elias remained in the yard long after the riders disappeared beyond the hills. The new barn stood behind him, its beams strong against the deepening sky. Somewhere near the creek, the wind began to move again through the cottonwood trees, carrying the familiar sounds of the valley back across the land. Elias Carter placed one hand against the fresh wood of the barn and looked out over Red Hollow Valley. In places like this, a man could live many years and still learn something new about the weight of a simple choice. And sometimes the quietest answer to a burned kindness was a valley that chose to remember.